Good evening and welcome to the Inupiat Heritage Center. Thank you very much for coming out tonight to see our new exhibit, the story of the first mammoth hunt in the Kiligvak from Anaktuvuk Pass, as told by both Raymond Paneak and Elijah Kakinya. I hope I said those right. To start us off, we are going to have a short talk by Rasic, and then we will have some questions and answers. You'll get to hear the legend in Inupiaq. It will scroll on the screen with subtitles in English and Inupiaq at the same time. And then we will have Raymond Paneak come say a few words. He's come all the way from Anaktuvuk Pass to be with us this evening. So thank you very much for coming. I want to tell you a little bit about Rasic. He is currently the Chief of Resources for the gates of the Arctic National Park and Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve, based in Fairbanks, Alaska. His professional training is in archaeology, and from 2003 to 2013, he was the archaeologist for the Gates and Yukon-Charlie. He also served as a curator of archaeology at the University of Alaska Museum from 2008 to 2012. He's worked in the Caribbean, Mid-Atlantic states, and Western U.S. over the last 17 years. And since 1995, he has focused on fieldwork and research in Alaska. His research interests include the early human settlement of Beringia, the analysis of stone tool assemblages, and archaeological survey and mapping methods. Recent projects include the geochemical analysis of obsidian artifacts and location of obsidian sources within Alaska, archaeological surveys in the Brooks Range and Yukon River, investigations of biogeography, and extinction of large game animals in Alaska. Please join me in welcoming Rasic.
Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you, Patuk, and the rest of the IHLC staff. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Mary Beth mentioned, there's some topics that I've spent time learning about and researching in my career that a number of them come together in this exhibit. So it's a really happy occasion for me to be here to talk a little bit about these things that are so interesting. This exhibit, of course, is focused on an oral history account from two elders from Anaktuvuk Pass, Inupiat elders, Elijah Kakinya and Raymond Paneak, who relayed this story. It was recorded about a mammoth hunt. It's a really fantastic story because it must have been a very long time ago. Mammoths don't live in Alaska anymore, and they haven't lived here for a long time. And what I would like to do today is augment that story a little bit by providing some context from recent archaeological and paleontological work that helps us understand how really fascinating and interesting this story is that these two elders passed on. Here's some photographs of Simon and Elijah. And I know that Raymond will talk more about them. I first became aware of this story. I think this book was published. It's by an archaeologist named Jack Campbell, who worked out of the University of New Mexico for years and did a lot of research in Anaktuvuk Pass in the 1950s and 60s. He published this book in 1998, so I guess that makes it about 16 years since I've known about this story. And he, in addition to telling the story, Raymond Paneak also drew a series of drawings. So if you've been through the exhibit, you've seen those displayed, and they're really fascinating drawings because they literally illustrate this great story, and they bring to mind all these, the realism and the detail of an event that, as it would have happened a very long time ago. You could easily picture the sound of the dogs barking and the people chasing the mammoths and shouting to each other and breathing heavily as they ran across the tundra. The This was one of several stories that Simon drew and gave to Dr. Campbell. These folks should know are in the archives at Gates of the Arctic National Park in Fairbanks, and the reason they're there is because the entire body of Jack Campbell's personal papers went together as one unit to the Park Service archives. But among them are these illustrations of all kinds of stories and details of Inupiaq life from historic times, and it's an important archive that's out there. Back to our story, one of the interesting parts of this story that I find is that there's one tell in here that suggests to me that the stories were a little bit flexible. This was a story that, if we take it at face value, had been told for thousands of years and passed on for generation to generation. And if the science is correct on this account, the last mammoths lived in Alaska about 13,000 years ago. So picture 600 generations of storytelling that culminated in this last telling of the story when it was documented and illustrated here. One of the interesting things here is that Simon's use of the term early man. Early man was lying on the ground hiding. This was the hunter. Knowing that he produced these illustrations for an anthropologist and an archaeologist, and knowing that early man was archaeologist lingo from the 1960s, tells me that Simon was modifying the story just a little bit to speak in the lingo that his customer in a way was, or his colleague was in this case. So it shows me, we know by all accounts that Simon and Elijah were master storytellers, and to me this is a little bit of an indication of one of the tricks a master storyteller does in tying into the interests and the language that the listener is bringing to the interaction. So with that in mind, I'm going to do a little bit of the same today, and I'm going to add the scientific perspective on some of these topics from recent research. And the way I see it, the story is like a great recipe, a great maybe soup or stew recipe that, depending on what ingredients are available in your refrigerator or pantry that day, you might tweak the recipe a little bit, but it's still a great dish in the end, and the substance is less flexible. The two things I'll discuss today, I mentioned, is research on archaeology and paleontology. So archaeology, the physical remains of people's activities, camps, artifacts they've left behind, and paleontology, the fossil remains of animals from the past. And I'll focus mostly on large mammals because there's a great record of large mammal fossils on the North Slope. This slide, which is also part of the exhibit, nicely summarizes pretty major findings that have occurred over the last 10 to 15 years. And the basic pattern to note here is that the age of these, the age of a number of extinct animals has gotten younger in recent years. So, for example, mammoths that were thought to have been extinct 17 or 18,000 years ago in northern Alaska are now known to have become extinct 13,000 years ago. And then on the other end of this graph, we see that the record of human presence in northern Alaska has gotten older. So that what I'm saying is there's greater overlap between people and a number of extinct animals. And that's it's a new enough finding that hasn't really made it into textbooks, so it's not widely known, and it's a really interesting local story that's emerged in recent times. I'll start with a little bit of the archaeology background here. The Mesa site is the most famous Ice Age site, the most famous site that dates to more than about 10,000 years ago in northern Alaska. This is one that might be known to people here in Arrow. It is located on Inupiaq Creek, and just south of the Brooks Range foothills. It occurs on top of this prominent hill, and it served as a hunting lookout. And what archaeologists have found on top of this hill are something like 50 remnants of ancient campfires, and around each of those campfires is a set of artifacts that are entirely consist of stone tools, and a major category of stone tool that's found around these campfires are spear points like the one shown in this slide. They're about 3 inches long, and these probably would have been the tips of darts, or maybe just darts, spears that were thrown with a throwing board, or even handheld spears that were just held in the hand or even thrown. There are no bones or animal remains preserved at this site, so there's no very clear evidence of what people were hunting at the Mesa site. But we presume it's big game, because these are fairly large spear points. They're made of stone, they're sharp, and we have good recent examples of people using that kind of tool on large game, the size of caribou or maybe larger. Another kind of spear point or projectile point that archaeologists have found in the last 10 years across Arctic Alaska is shown here on the left. On the right is a mesa point, a mesa-type projectile point.
Closer to that mic.
And on the left is this other kind of spear point called a sluiceway point. The mesa points tend to occur on the north slope and in the Brooks Range foothills, the central Brooks Range and the central north slope. These sluiceway projectile points tend to occur, they tend to be centered on the western Brooks Range, the Inupiaq River basin, and within the mountains. So they have a little bit different distribution, but sometimes they occur in the same site. We don't know if these were different kinds of tools used by different bands or different tribes or different groups of people, or whether it's just a different kind of tool used for a different purpose. One maybe is used for caribou, and the other, for example, on bison. That's a possibility, but we don't know the details. In any case, they're different, and in both cases, these artifacts occur with those fire hearths, which contain charcoal, which can be radiocarbon dated. So we know the age of these artifacts. When archaeologists find artifacts of this shape in Arctic Alaska, we can say those sites date to the Ice Age. Those sites, in all the cases we've dated them, are older than 10,000 years old, older than about 11,000 years old, really. In a few of these sluiceway sites, we see an interesting pattern where there's really large numbers of these projectile points. And in this particular case shown in this slide, it's a site called the Caribou Crossing. And it was given that name because it's threaded with hundreds and hundreds of deep caribou trails. And the site's situated in a very narrow pass right at the Brooks Range divide. This is at the head of the Kugurorek River, which is in the Inupiaq River basin, again in the western Brooks Range. But there's something approaching 150 of these large spear points there. It looks like people were engaged in, back to the Paneak illustrations of the mammoth hunt, where there's a group of hunters working cooperatively to harvest game. We think a similar situation occurred at a site like this, where there's just large numbers of tools that were broken in use. They were broken in the process of stabbing large animals, and like the Mesa site, a nearby site there is where people repaired the broken weapons. And this is just an illustration of a reconstruction of how those large spear points might have been hafted into a foreshaft, which then was attached to a larger spear shaft. A third kind of artifact occurs in northern Alaska. This is called a fluted projectile point. The famous kind of fluted point is called Clovis, or another kind is Folsom. These occur all over North America. And for something like 60 years, archaeologists have found these in Alaska, but only until the last couple of years, just until the last few years, they were never dated. So we don't know if these dated to the Ice Age like they do in the lower 48, where we have them in dated context, and importantly, where fluted points are associated with mammoths and bison, extinct animals. So Clovis hunters in the lower 48 were mammoth hunters. It's a very real possibility that fluted point users in Alaska were also hunting mammoths and other extinct animals. But again, the problem is we rarely find, or until very recently, have never found animal bones associated with any of these projectile points. So we've been at a loss to explain just exactly what these hunters were hunting. This is an artifact. This was the very first fluted point found in Alaska. It's from the Inupiat River, the headwaters of the Inupiat River, right near the Brooks Range, on the north side of the Brooks Range. A cast of this artifact, the original's in the Smithsonian, but a cast is in the exhibit. They're pretty small. They're smaller than Clovis points, so it's uncertain if they would have been used as mammoths. But there isn't a nice, neat correlation between projectile point size and prey size, so it's hard to say. One site that I've worked on in the last few years, it's a new discovery. It's a site called Raven Bluff. You can see it's on this hilltop, a similar setting to the Mesa site. It's a raised landform where you have a good view, where hunters sat and repaired their weapons while looking for game. This site's located on the Kiligvak River, not too far from the Red Dog Mine. And at this site, we found animal bones. It's deep enough that the deposits at the site have been in permafrost for over 10,000 years, and this bone has been frozen. The surprise here was that every piece of bone at this site is caribou. So it's a living species. It didn't fit any of our expectations for these Ice Age hunters targeting extinct animals like bison and mammoth. But it's one site. It could have been a site, for all we know, that was occupied for 3 or 4 days. So it could just be a small sample of the entire menu for these hunters. So I'm going to switch over a little bit and chat about paleontology. Even more exciting finds have been made in the realm of paleontology and Ice Age paleontology on the Arctic slope in the last 10 years. This map here shows some of the fossil hotspots, Ice Age fossil hotspots in Alaska. In a way, it's a map of where placer gold mining has occurred too. You can see the Klondike shows up on here. You can see Fairbanks shows up around here. This is where miners have blasted away frozen silt or muck deposits. And one of the things that comes out in addition to gold is lots of Ice Age animals. But the exceptions to those mining districts are the Arctic slope, the Ikpikpak River, for example, the Mead River. There's large inactive and semi-active dune fields around Teshikpuk Lake. These all are very fossil-rich areas, and these Ice Age, the remains of these Ice Age animals come out of the banks of, for example, the Ikpikpak River. This is an artist's reconstruction of what the animals during the last Ice Age consisted of. It's a scene from interior Alaska, but the scene would have been very similar on the Arctic slope. You can recognize mammoths in here. Bison was a major species. This is an extinct form of muskox, sheep. So all the modern animals plus several other large and, for all we know, tasty animals were walking around on the Arctic slope. This one? This one? Oh, great question. That's a saiga antelope. It's a large dog-sized antelope. These still live in Mongolia on the steppes, and they travel in herds of hundreds of thousands. These were probably extinct well before people arrived in Alaska or Thuringia. We think the last saiga died out about 17,000 years ago. But it's a really interesting animal. They have a huge nasal cavity that seems to be designed to filter out all the dust that these giant herds generate in that kind of dry environment. great question. Here's a riverbank on the Ikpikpak River. You can see these very thick silt deposits. They're frozen too, so the exposure we see is thawed out because it's been exposed to the sun. But if you dug any amount of way into the bank, you'd run into permafrost really fast. That's why there's such great fossil preservation. It's not even really accurate to call these fossils in a way because they're frozen when you, many of the bones found along the bottom of these banks when they erode out will still have preserved marrow in them. And in some cases, the remains of the ant, there's soft tissue that's been preserved in it. Almost complete bison was found about 2 years ago on the Ikpikpak River. The brain tissue was still in the brain case. That's how tremendous the preservation is in this setting. And what occurs is that as the river meanders across into these deposits, the bones fall to the bottom of the bank, and over the years they'll wash down to other gravel bars and accumulate on the gravel bars. So, and partly triggered by that gap in knowledge about what people were hunting at the Mesa site, the BLM supported some research in this area. And what the biologists and paleontologists would do was float the river, and they would collect all the bones they found. And then they did a really kind of clever thing, kind of an expensive thing too. They radiocarbon dated hundreds of these bones, so they could say which particular animals were living at any given time, and the thing we're interested in here today, when these different species became extinct. So if you date enough animals, you get pretty close, you can start to approach what the last animal was that survived. This is just another example of the kinds of bones you'll find in these deposits. They also occur at the edge of lakes that are thawing, and similar process happens at the margin of lakes on the Arctic slope. Mammoths were one of the common species. Almost certainly the species that Paneak and Kakinya were talking about was mammoth. They mentioned mastodon. Although mastodon fossils do occur in Alaska, they're incredibly rare. So almost always when you hear people talk about mastodons, in Alaska, they really mean mammoth. And there's straightforward ways to distinguish between the bones and tusks of these two species. They have different shapes and characteristics. So mammoths were present on the North Slope. Mastodons were, but very rare, and they were extinct much earlier than the end of the Ice Age, maybe 50,000 or more years ago. Horses are the most common bone found in any of the deposits on the North Slope, and that's different than interior Alaska, where bison are dominant. And caribou and muskox are also very common in these assemblages, so the modern species did occur on the Arctic slope. They're very rare in interior Alaska, so one of the pictures that's emerged is that the environment and the animals in interior Alaska and the Klondike were substantially different than the environment on the Arctic slope at the end of the Ice Age. Here's some of the oddball animals that lived up there. This woodland muskox on the top. It's a tall, lanky muskox. It's a different species than modern muskox. And then the one on the bottom, this is the most amazing thing to me. I can't believe this isn't the cover of National Geographic one month. Lions lived on the Arctic slope here until 11,000 years ago. So they overlapped with people for 1,000 years. People, the very first people that lived in this region, didn't just face grizzly bears and polar bears and wolves. They faced lions that were adapted to running down and taking full-grown bison. And these bison are larger than modern bison. So this was a really different world that these people lived in. And again, it makes it all that more amazing to sit back and think of the story that's relayed by Kakinya and Paneak. And of course, this eventually came to an end. These animals became extinct. People may have played a role in that. We don't know. Hunting pressure could have been a factor, but the really obvious factor was the change in environment. The Bering Land Bridge had existed until this time, and but as sea levels rose and the climate warmed, the Bering Strait opened up. It changed interior Alaska and the Arctic slope from a continental climate with sunny skies, and it was the Ice Age. Summers were cooler, but the skies were sunnier and the soils were more productive, and permafrost was less common. This is what we see today. Permafrost is prevalent. The soils are not very productive. They're frozen. And it's a very different kind of vegetation and landscape. And all those grazing animals that existed in the Ice Age died out about this time. So climate was the main driver behind the extinction of those animals. Whether people played a role or some part of that role, we don't know. It's a really tricky thing to answer. So just revisiting that slide, you can see that all these big changes were happening right around 14 to 13,000 years ago. Changes in vegetation, changes in the archaeology. Those mesa, sluiceway, and fluted point sites all go away after this time. Those people seem to have been adapted to that unique environment. Just quickly return to those fossil deposits on the Ikpikpak River and other places on the North Slope. Even after the animals went away, these bones were there. And this has been a really important resource for people for 13,000 years. So after these were food resources, the fossil material, the ivory, was a raw material that undoubtedly people that traveled this landscape knew about and would collect. So it seems no surprise to me that the illustrations that Paneak created of the mammoth hunt show the mammoth bones at the bottom of a bluff, just like this one here. He undoubtedly would have seen mammoth ivory and animal bones in these kinds of settings during his lifetime, and probably collected them to make tool handles and other, just to use as a raw material. We know there's a long tradition of using these fossil materials. We find fossil ivory and fossil animal bone in archaeological sites of all different ages. This is a site that I did some research on the Inupiat River, where we found 30,000-year-old bison bones in a 16th century Inupiaq site. So these were collected from a gravel bar. They were water-worn and tumbled, and they were found in this house along with 16th century artifacts. These are a few ethnographic collections from the University of Alaska Museum that all have ivory or fossil bone as a component of them. And these date to the last, less than 200 years ago or so. But they're the continuation of that long tradition. And you can see the wide variety of things that people used ivory and fossil bone for. It's very easy to identify mammoth ivory. There are these distinctive patterns called Schrager lines in them, and this is how wildlife agents distinguish mammoth bone from, or mammoth ivory from elephant ivory today. There's an easy way to tell them apart, and many of these artifacts here have that characteristic, so we know they're mammoth ivory. This is a dipper or a ladle that was collected around Barrow, and this is probably the most remarkable artifact of mammoth ivory I've seen. It's large. It's the size of a cantaloupe, and the amazing thing is how thin the walls of this ivory are. And the most amazing thing of all is that it hasn't fallen apart. If anybody has worked with ivory or found old ivory on the surface, you'll know that as soon as it dries out, it exfoliates and falls apart. But this thin-walled, large dipper or bowl has never fallen apart in the last 200 years. So one of the things it suggests to me is that people had a long tradition of working with these materials and knew lots of tricks for working with it. They knew the technical properties of these materials and knew how to make them work in certain ways. There's just a couple other examples of mammoth ivory and fossil material and used in different tools. A fishing lure, the lid of a baby basket, ulu handle.
Is mammoth ivory more dense than maybe you might say walrus ivory?
Yeah, the question is how mammoth ivory compares to walrus ivory in terms of its characteristics. And I don't know the answer, but I would bet somebody does, and I would bet there is a difference. Yeah, I think that's exactly the point I'm trying to make here, is that people knew the characteristics of these different materials and very purposely selected mammoth ivory probably for certain applications. Here you see a scraper handle, a net shuttle. The heads of these dolls are made of mammoth ivory. And I'll wrap it up there. I'll kind of finish my story and turn it over to you. I think a great story gets greater over time if it's retold. So hopefully I could plant a couple of ideas in your minds that you can turn around and entertain your kids with, or present to students, or whatever the case may be. These stories are important for hundreds of years, or for millennia. These stories stayed alive strictly through oral tradition. It completely astounds me. We've probably lost some of that ability to be great storytellers the way Paneak and Kakinya were, but they're certainly fantastic stories, and they have a lot of value, so I hope they stay alive, and I'm glad to see this exhibit spreading the good word on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we would like to open up to the audience for questions. We have our audience here. And if you've noticed our TV screen over there, we have a couple of libraries from around the state who have also tuned in to listen to our talk this evening, so we'll include them in our question and answer section. Any questions?
Yeah. Those spearheads, you said they're pretty common for, I saw one 19 graph, so that's a very, very good model to show how they were being reached. But that was found at the Mesa site, and then he showed, I think, a map of where a lot of those were also found in North America, and also what I'm trying to, those ones up there in the middle group right there, the lots of those here. Yeah, and was there any consistency? You said I think you were international in several places. If those tools, similar tools, are found like in Norway, in Europe, or those places.
Right. Well, so the question is whether tools like this are found around the world and other regions. Yeah. So I have to have two or three answers, because there are 2 or 3 different kinds of artifacts here. These kinds of spear points, it's kind of a generalized form, and these do occur around North America, even in Siberia. There's things similar to this. I think what archaeologists look at here, though, is some idiosyncratic details of these artifacts in Alaska. Personally, I would say we don't see anything just like that anywhere other than northern Alaska. These are pretty distinct to this region. The other answer I would give pertains to these artifacts, these fluted points. They have this real characteristic basal thinning. There's this exaggerated flake removed from the base, you can see there. The fulsome point is the best example, and that's the flute, that big flake scar in the middle of the tool. That is an idiosyncratic thing that we only see in this period of time, but we see it very widespread. It occurs from Central America all the way to northern Alaska, so over a huge range within about 1,000 years. This was the fad of that millennia. This was the cool thing to do. The thing we found at Raven Bluff, that site there, we were able to date it. This is the big surprise. Forever, archaeologists have assumed, because people came over the Bering Land Ridge and they occupied Alaska first, and then colonized the rest of North America, that the fluted points in Alaska had to be older. But what we found is they're younger by many centuries. So what it looks like is that this fluting technology developed south of the ice sheets here in the lower 48 and then moved north late in the ice age. That's a surprising finding, but it's what all the data is pointing to right now. Did that answer your question? As far as being found in other parts of the world, no. The fluted projectile points are only found in the Americas. That's an invention of Americans and the New World. As far as those other projectile points, in a very general sense, they're found in other regions, but in the specific sense of these tools, they're really only found in northern Alaska.
This is Arnold Brower, so for the record, but you know, I'm just intrigued by the professional cut that are made. The tool that you use has to be precise, or the carver is pretty precise. And if it's the same rock from the university in North America, then the carbon dating of that was rock, was the style, how did the carbon dating age to the age?
Yeah, the question is, how is the age of these stone tools found out? I mentioned earlier finding those campfires and fire hearths and charcoal. That's the main source of material for dating, and radiocarbon dating is the most precise way to date these things. What you need to do then is make this little bit of a jump. It's a pretty logical jump to say that the artifacts found around a campfire date to the same time as the campfire. In other words, you can't directly date the stone tools. You have to find them in association with something organic, charcoal or bone, that you can then link the age to. So the ideal case for archaeologists is to find these in a buried setting where there's a thin layer, and everything in that layer dates to the same time period, and you have the charcoal and bone in there and things for radiocarbon dating, and the layer above it is a little bit younger and so forth. But it's tricky in Alaska because our layers are this thick, they get mixed up, and I can tell you many times you find a stone spearhead next to a 30-06 shell. So those things they're mixed together. It's confusing. There's just a few cases like Mesa, the Raven Bluff site, where we can really tie down some of these questions.
Two questions. One, I found it interesting, sort of counterintuitive. You said that there was actually less permafrost during the post-glaciation period, so it was warmer in the interior Alaska. Okay.
It's less to do with temperature and what the process that's in place. You're exactly right. It's counterintuitive. So during the Ice Age, when the climate was cooler, permafrost was less prevalent in Alaska. And the reason is because of the vegetation mass. So if you think about the tundra, the spongy, thick, lichen tundra out there, it's a great insulator. And once that develops, it insulates the ground below it, and the permafrost can survive. And it begins a cycle. So that's one of the things that happens around 14,000 years ago, give or take. And it's different in different places, but it's called paludification. It's the buildup of that vegetation starts a cycle, and it builds up the organic matter, and it creates this insulating mat that preserves permafrost or frozen ground for the end of the year.
A second question is around Inupiaq Lake. You mentioned those bluffs. There's a mixture of marine mammal bones and terrestrial mammal bones and bison. How do you explain that?
I don't know a lot about that. I'm just generally familiar with that, and it's true. I've seen cases where there's marine mammal bones far inland, and it suggests to me that the coastline was higher at one time. I suspect those fossils are very ancient and date to a time when sea level was higher.
Yes,
But that's beyond my time frame. I'm not a real expert on that. Yeah.
Whale bones and terrestrial mammal bones.
You know, another explanation is those things are transported by people inland to camps. I've seen that in a few cases. That Kiligvak site that I showed an example of a bison bone in a 16th century house. There's also a stellar sea cow bone in that site, which is really hard to explain. There's no record of those being anywhere near, and this is tens of miles up the Inupiat River. It was never stellar sea cow habitats. People clearly brought it up there.
Yeah, they were loose.
So bones move around. If you see a lot of them, it's probably a natural cause.
My name is Vera Williams. I just have a question. When you look at the whole state of Alaska and the bones that are being found throughout the state of Alaska, are the bones that are found in the Arctic also found in the lowest part of Alaska, or are they all different sources of species? Just kind of wondering if certain species of the state of Alaska.
Yeah, the question is whether in different parts of the state, in different parts of Alaska, you see different fossil types, different species.
Yeah, is there any similar ones to the ones in Alaska or the Ikpikpak area?
In a general sense, all the same species that occur on the Arctic slope occur in other parts of Alaska. What's different is the proportions. So on the Arctic slope, horses are very common, and caribou are relatively common. In interior Alaska, bison are the most common, and caribou and muskox are much rarer. So there's different proportions of animals in different parts of the state, and this is one of the developments that's happening in scientific thinking really in just the last 5 or 10 years. That it wasn't all one simple picture across all of Alaska or Thuringia. That was the notion for many years for the Ice Age fauna. And now with a lot more of the dating, a lot of the focus studies in different areas, we're seeing more of the detail and nuance and the differences across the area. And there definitely are differences. You know, the other area I showed on there and didn't really talk about as a fossil hotspot is around Kotzebue and the Seward Peninsula. There are a lot of fossils found there, and nobody's done a project like this that's been done on the Arctic slope with a lot of dating. And I suspect that someday somebody will, and they'll find a different picture altogether of what the large mammal community was in that part of the state, close to the Bering Land Bridge or the Bering Strait.
You talked about the design of the coming from the lower 48 and moving back into the Marcellus area. That implies that there's some type of trade relationship or something.
Yeah.
Is there any other evidence backing that?
Yeah, it's an idea. It's an idea that's supported by a few radiocarbon dates right now. So a few more radiocarbon dates or a few new site discoveries could change the picture. But for now, that's what the picture is. And you're right, it suggests that people or those projectile points or the idea of manufacturing things that way move north. That's the question we don't know the answer to. Was this just an idea that was passed from mouth to mouth and the idea spread, or were people actually moving north and carrying these tools with them? There's not a lot of other evidence to look at. It's conceivable to find, say, rocks of a very specific type that occur south, and then we find them north, and to look for direction of travel, but none of that evidence has emerged yet.
Thank you very much. We are running behind, so we're going to skip past our recorded story by Simon Paneak. And if you would like to hear the story yourself, we will have it available if you want to request it specifically through the Inupiat Heritage Center. I would like to introduce our second speaker for the evening, Raymond Paneak, who was born in Kiligvak Lake in the summer of 1940. Raymond is the son of the late Simon Paneak and the grandson of the late Elijah Kakinya. Before the settlement of Anaktuvuk Pass, Raymond attended school in Chinawa in Oregon. He worked for the North Slope Borough since its establishment and served on various committees, commissions, and boards until his retirement. He has served as a village board member for the Inupiaq Corporation and for the city of Anaktuvuk Pass, a village representative for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and various other committees for the state of Alaska. Since 1980, Raymond has served as a board member for the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. Raymond had the privilege to live the nomadic life alongside his parents and grandparents until the settlement of Anaktuvuk Pass. He acquired a lot of knowledge about Inupiaq traditions from his father and grandfather. To this day, he still practices his traditional way of life and passes down his knowledge at any opportunity that he can. Please join me in welcoming Raymond Paneak.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I'm proud that somebody put exhibit like that of my dad, drawing, and I'm proud of that. I thought it wouldn't happen. I guess it's happening now. That's very good. I like to see that. Because I read it and I read those books. But I want to say that Mr. Jack Campbell, he was an early archaeologist that went up to Anaktuvuk, and he came to visit my dad, and he said, "Simon, I want you to draw something for us." He asked him. So here, a big stack of paper, and then my dad started drawing. And I'm glad that Jack Campbell, he wanted him to draw, so he drew a lot of those, the whole book, But also, part of my dad, he never been in school. Never had been in school, but he write better than we are when we into school, but he write better than us. And he speak better than us. I'm proud of that. But again, I want to thank somebody think of the exhibit of my dad and also Elijah Kakinya. Another Elijah Kakinya is my grandfather. He's a well-known person also. So they I always heard them that they always talk about those Kiligvak, those not the time that call them Kiligvak, those Tuktoholu. But then they always tell stories about them. Another one nice. My dad's story was that flying whale. I think some of the people knows that too. Flying whale, what he also draws. And I'm happy that somebody put this together. I'm really happy. Because not only that, but then also there's some other Inupiaq that live up here, knows a lot of other stuff like that. But when I was growing up, we used to stay at Kiligvak Lake. That's 20 miles, maybe 17 miles north of Anaktuvuk. But that area, Kiligvak Lake, is a lot of old campgrounds here I will witness. Lots of old campsite in Rurik side, some of the old South House area, camp area, and also right by the lake, while ago too that not only Eskimos were living here, but also some of the Athabascan were living up there too. That's many, many, many years ago. So I'm glad that both sides were living up there, Athabascan and also this Inupiat. So anyway, I'm glad something come up with those two books on my dad like. One about this life and one about those drawing. That's, I want to say, I kept saying Jack Campbell, you know, he's very big person, big archaeologist. But also my dad worked with archaeologists, anthropologists, geologists, and early researchers. He worked with them before he come from the coast. So, in a way, I want to thank you. I'm glad to see something like this happen from my area. Koyanat.
Does anyone have any questions for Raymond? Mr. Paneak? Do the libraries have any questions for our speakers?
Hey, this is Haynes.
Hi, Haynes. Welcome.
Hi. So we were curious where we could get a copy of the story so that we could actually read through the story.
You can contact us at www.inupiatheritagecenter.org.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, it's just inupiatheritage.org. Or you can call us at 907-852-0422 and we can give you more instructions on how to get a copy.
Thank you.
How long is the film?
The story is about 12 minutes. We have an audio recording. We also have a computer file. Yeah, we can play it right now. Yes. Okay. It's only showing part of the screen, Jeff. Can you see it's cutting off half of the screen? I don't know if it's projector problem.
Probably just your projector.
Okay, we're having some technical difficulties. Only half the screen is being projected.
Very utility. Have your utility.
You have to hold it down for a minute.
While they're done,
Yes.
just want to thank Raymond for coming. I'm Arnold Brower. I'm the Deputy Director of Planning for IHC. And this is one of the first things that I've attended to see what these folks would produce, what you can hear here. It just dawned on me that Raymond was speaking about it. Elijah was giving oral history, and he got it from his father, Elijah Kakinya, who was probably, his father was probably 90 years old. So this is about 200 or 300 years of information that he's passing on. I was remembering Maddie Botchus. The last time I went to speak to her, she was 101 years old. And she was giving us similar stories. And this was passed down to her from her from her grandmother. So that was, she's 102 years old. From there, when she was 5 years old, and that person, her grandmother, is 90 years old. That's 200 years of information they passed on. So this is how things were passed on. I enjoyed a lot at the whale camp from when I was a little boy. For instance, somebody like Pete Sutolet, who was 70-some years old back then, and told us stories about the ancient stories about how whales are caught, who caught them, who did what, and those kind of stories. And his memory was so impeccable that the century-year-old story, the names of the people, the players, he was given names, and some of these names I don't recognize today. And those are some of the things that we would hear from Elijah when we speak to him. I got to know him a little bit. I met his father once or twice. So that's the type of how information was brought down from generation. Are we ready?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are ready. So the first line is going to be in Inupiaq, and the second line is in English.
Inuit Inupiaq Toliki already being the Corville area. Inupiaq La Lima Inupiaq coming in Nasisha and Shoptown and the Tuan. But in a sharp drop, she did shock. So we had shock. Black team, but it's funny. Man, we're from Ikpikpak River, and then the Inupiaq election, the cheap Marat, now they got him, cut that court, we see it, but then we got not good. None of the Archaologist, Mr. Arnold, Inupiaq Heritage Center, some of the Archaologist for the team. But he, Mr. Arnold, to try the action. In the people in Inupiaq, Makat look to him much to them, Matuka action, she yummy. We are talking nature. Ikpikpak River, Kiligvak, Archaologist, Ikpikpak Sukunamut Pisilangin, Sukunamut Action Park, Tamak Masungan Yaho, Silami, San Action. Itu sama nakal ni Ikpikpak River. Kiligvak atau pertumaan Ikpikpak River. So called not out of Nazi, out of double bladed in a part. Makiwa in a shop. As you work, out of Nazi in a hammer, I kahit manata, ang mutte sila payata, tao tunangin niya, si buwan ni tao tulay niya, sila ka talaga niya. Sila ka yun eh, sila kita tulakan, kita sila orang unang panlok sa kami, iletok. Pangaligurang ano siya, ang mutte sila, kanlinya, kuning maurak kara. Yan itu manut ko akalo ni, sedak soprano ng inyo. Kanlig magtaburak, kitmix. Sisa manuto, maliga ka nagat. Kanlig rin naman. Berarti, nakigilig niya kalunod dahil na pangaligura ka na sa na. Ang muster kaldi keluar dengan pengunjung wartawan tak ninyo panlumaro awlat sa iyo nakaniakto tao kumitsok siro panagalo ng masa ra tikmit sisa matan Kila kalalingat, sila tak pengaliktas. Kami juga perlu kainya namu tu lagro dari nak teman nak. Muteluk, namu tu sok. Rekrumat, minta tukmik, tak matem malira kalutat nak kiri kusimami. Kino tama. Kaya, am na kinik sa kayo ma. Kinunawa, tama lumang kasalo. So, agong makot tabingit. Hindi nakpakaloktuat sila ko. Sila ko tao pakpakaloktuat sa linyo na utit. Hindi sumaw. Hindi rin ikakita. Si Maningnya coba menyeksir, orang tak guna nunalik bel kalau tanya nunalik tak ini sama tu itu, wajib nalanya kami tahu semua alim angutip, Allah tidak kami sebarang, ya, ini kemana? Ini aku rakanian. Pada Ikpikpak River Lecture Ini aku rakanian. Malikutak. Oh, kuna lalu lalu tak ini di mana tak. Macam ini mereka situasi tahunya kita pakai dokter teman tu malu. Menunggu lagi nak pakai roti ni usaha dulu. Dan nak panen ni sekulit. Dan nak doa kalau kami dalam tamak amat sahanak tu. Makin kuat tu dah anak sahanak tu semua. Semua baca. Upaya lagi firma. Ningira aku kata. Mood law ini waktu itu, hotel ini pelukar juga pernah. Ningira kupati, nak ada ni, kamu orang ke. So gua hotel ini dari dulu, taman hotel itu. Tangi itu, ku sinyal itu kalau ini lami, berpisah dari nama-nama. Ang wala ako nata ang ito ang ito tulay ang meron niya ang pinangatap ko ito ko ang sikat na dilakting ko ang meron ito siligat ada yang semua aku kuat, Kiligvak, Kiligvak, Kiligvak Maneak, Teesunitsuk, Inupiaq, Kiligvak, Rasic, Kiligvak tualuktuk, Kiligvak. Kiligvak tualuktuk. Yang ada indeksonnya aktif kami juga. Sama seluruh semua keluarga Rasic. Lalu yuk Kiligvak sekali, anak tualik. Cuma sedikit beragam sama kau awal hidup anak tak. Kau Kiligvak ni kau lagi menyakit. Ada yang siapa tak? Kiligvak yang siapa tu tiga. Kiligvak yang siapa dulu? Kiligvak yang sama. Nak sokal ini yang bilang kuala TikTok. Ada yang saksi juga kelam buat kita. Kuala itu kata. Ini nak saya cuma cakap macam mana anak tuan kedulik. Rasic, nak melihat ada kamu, nak kira begini. Sebab nak kira nilai tamna. Tapi kini itu, nak kira Rasic tamna. Ini nak nawar. Kalau kita tahu Kiligvak Paneak, nagpakahamir. Kapuro kami tuwa pahamir. Pati na sa kaliyan na kilatak. Nawatak. Nabragok na ako. Kiligvak. Nabrag na ka na. Kinaksin. Nung namin taman. Tago mo, tago paksin natin. Okay, kapatid ko ano. Kaburani. Sama kami dulu menerima kami kima. Kalau tamat kena anu bawa ni niat tu nama. Kalau siulet nak Kiligvak. Bagi apa tu? Kalau imereme tu masuk nama. Sama anak oleh anak masih yang tiga lama. Dan buat lihat saya kata sibuk. Sebab nak Kiligvak tamat ko. Malungay yung nakagay simat ko. Dan nanti jawala tagelah tuang. At lagi yung nakarating sa mo. Pisnapit. Iyan Ikpikpak River tuwa sa Archaologist nikim. Mitkuligo kimat ko Kiligvak. Mana? Ang ilusuo. Kimat ko nilalukasli. Seperti Kiligvak ni kami mutikalah tapi. Seperti Kiligvak ni ang rakaksit pakai naksit rakaksit mata. Sila kami kadang ada ko kasi lagi tak rumah anggur kerja itu kita belum ang lakukan matikibu pinilai tak ko anggur terus tapi berok sila kutatpaw tak ko niaktik sila niaktik kimlat makatakan itu matautung na dia utik tinggalin itu, bukan tunat tinggalin itu, tunat kita kami itu, kalau orang yang itu nak itu kata hubungan, anggota orang, pateri miak poin miak, nanti lelak, sama isu atik itu, kamu buruk.
Thank you again for coming to visit us at the Heritage Center. We will be open for another 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll be closing our doors for the evening. But we are open Monday through Friday from 8:30 to 5, but we do close at lunch between 12 and 1. This exhibit shall be up for a while, probably another year or so, so feel free to come back and read the panels at your leisure, and help yourself to some light refreshments on your way out. Thank you very much.